Okay, yeah, so in this first presentation, we draw on the analysis, on ongoing analysis of the CAP plans in Central Eastern Europe to provide some reflections on whether the CAP in Central Eastern Europe supports ambitious climate action. So this is really collaborative effort with a number of member state experts. The contributors are listed below, and I say that it's ongoing because we've done most of the analysis on the budgets and on indicators, etc. But we are still following through with a few of the sort of design aspect analysis. Okay, next slide, please. So if we look at the relevance of the CAP and its impact in relation to climate, this really depends on at least these four key aspects. First, how well the programming is aligned with the needs for climate, what the budget allocation and the CAP is and the area that is covered, the share of the area that is covered. Then, of course, on the design of the interventions themselves, but also how well the interventions, the different measures are combined, whether these combinations are effective to support synergies or if there's also some conflicts. And then, of course, on the actual implementation and uptake of the interventions, not just on the stated targets and plans. Now, given that it's too early to look at the actual implementation and uptake, we focus reflections on the first 3 points, and in particular, the second aspect on the budget allocation area, supported also with some reflections on the design. And in the discussion and exchange part session after the coffee break, we're really keen also to hear your thoughts on the design and any insights on the implementation and likely uptake. Next slide, please. To start off, just a few reminders on the climate needs. Those who were in the first webinar saw this slide already before. The agricultural emissions in the region dropped significantly in the early 90s. And then much less until 2010, but actually since 2010, they've been increasing slightly. And in many countries, the livestock populations have decreased slightly from 2016 to 2020. But overall in the region, the Eurostat data shows that the livestock numbers have increased somewhat since 2016. LULUCF removals, on the other hand, have also been decreasing due to a number of natural events, extreme events, and there's a need to step up ambition both for reducing emissions and increasing removals. Next slide, please. When we look at the total mitigation potentials, I think it's really important that we note that this is data for EU as a whole, that nature-based solutions, so including managing peatlands, agroforestry, and measures that maintain and enhance stock on mineral soils are very important for mitigating emissions and increasing removals. And equally, or even more important, if their potential is really used in terms of the mitigation potential as compared to the technical measures under livestock, manure management, as well as nutrient management in croplands and grasslands. So these are aggregate figures for EU as a whole. We don't have specific figures for the region, but it's clear that NBS is important in the region. As a whole, of course, we need the whole mosaic of the different mitigation potentials to be used optimally. So it's important that we look also at what the balance is between these different types of mitigation actions and the CAPs. Next slide, please. Finally, as in terms of context framing, the adaptation needs in the region are also very significant, since recent extreme events also this past summer clearly demonstrate, from droughts to flooding to hail to frosts, there's quite urgent need to work on increasing the resilience of agricultural production in the region. Okay, so now I turn to my colleague Aaron, who will take us through what we can see in the CAPs in the region in terms of budget allocation. Aaron, the word's yours.
Thank you, Anna. Aaron Scheid, Ecologic Institute, working at the agriculture team, mainly on common agriculture policy and CAP-related issues. And if you go to the next slide, so maybe two introduction words to the CAP and the budget. So the CAP makes a very large part of the total budget in the European Union, and it's a key lever for land management and climate action. And so that's why we look at the budget now, because it is important to see the ambition and the output of the CAP, not only for CEE, but for all Europe. But of course, it's not the only thing to look at. So also the design of the interventions is important. But for now, we will just have a look at the total budget. And this is a preliminary analysis of the budget we are doing for CEE. And what we're doing is to try to always look at this 11 CEE countries, and then also compare this with the remaining EU 16 countries and the overall EU 27 to get a better picture. So when we now look at this at the slide, on the left side, we see the split between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and the two blue colors are the CEE countries, and the yellow colors are the EU 16, the remaining EU 16 countries. Whereas the darker colors are Pillar 1 and the lighter colors are the Pillar 2. And what we can see is that it is very similar for all of them. The Pillar 1 budget takes around 63% of the budget for both, or for all three, for CEE countries, for EU 16, but also for EU 27. And now if we turn to the right, then what we can see is that the CEE countries take around 1/3 of the UAA. UAA, that's the utilized agriculture area. If we look down into this table, then what we can also see is that the budget of the CEE countries is also around 1/3. So it seems very balanced, but what we also see is, and then we have to turn to the very right of this table, the budget per hectare of UAA. And what we can see here is that the budget per hectare is for the CEE countries much lower than for the remaining EU 16 countries. So for the CEE countries, it is around 1,660 euros per hectare, whereas for the remaining EU 16 countries, this is around 1,918 euros per hectare. So there is a difference, what we can see here. And now if we turn to the next slide, we can dive into the individual countries, which is also important to look at, because we see it is very, there is a strong difference between the countries when we look into Pillar 1, Pillar 2 budget allocation. So the darker blue color is Pillar 1, whereas the lighter blue color is Pillar 2 budget. What we can see is that the four CEE countries that have the largest UAA, so the utilized agriculture area in the CEE countries, which is Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, that three of them have a very big discrepancy between the two pillars, which are Poland, Romania, and Hungary. So we see, if you look at them, Hungary has 6.6 billion spent on Pillar 1 and a much lower amount spent on Pillar 2. The same accounts for Poland and Romania, where the discrepancy is very big. Whereas for other countries, and now looking especially at Czechia, Croatia, and Slovakia, where there's very much aligned the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 budget allocation. And another thing important to look at, and this is not shown in this slide, is the transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 and from Pillar 2 into Pillar 1, because the European Union gave the opportunity to do this transfer between these two pillars. And what we can see is that on average, for EU 27, the transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 is around 4.6. And this is also very much in line on what the CEE countries do. Just to give an example, Latvia has around 5%. of budget allocation from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. But now if we look at the other way around, from the transfer from Pillar 2 into Pillar 1, then the average on EU27 is around 3.9%. But then countries like Poland or Hungary have a very significant budget transfer taking place. Poland has around 24%, transferring the budget from Pillar 2 into Pillar 1, and Hungary 20%. And now if we turn to the next slide, we now look into the, or we dive into the interventions, because it's also important to look into where the budget is allocated in terms of the individual interventions. And what you see on the very left is the 11 CEE countries. So each bar represents one CE country, and on the left side, the reddish colors are Pillar 1, whereas the greenish colors on the right are Pillar 2 interventions. And this graph reflects around 97% of the total budget. So there are a few interventions that we haven't included here because they are not so important for our assessment. For example, risk management, we excluded. And what we can see here is that the distribution of funds per intervention varies between these countries. Just to give the example of Hungary, which has a huge share of the basic income support, which is this abbreviation BIS with the 2 S, basic income supports. But Czechia has a rather small amount of basic income support. If we now look into who has the biggest share of this basic income support, then we see Hungary, Latvia, and Poland have the biggest share giving into the basic income support. But what we can also see is that the coupled payments, which is this red color, also plays an important role. And this is also something Anna referred to at the very beginning, that livestock does play a big role, and coupled income support is plays a big role. And this we can see in the next slide then, which I will turn to, plays a big role in funding livestock. And for Hungary and Slovenia, we can see that the coupled income support has the same size than the eco schemes, for example. Whereas for other countries, for example, for Slovakia, the coupled income support is much smaller compared to the other interventions taking place. And another thing important to look at is the investment, which is on the right side, the dark green color, which is budget that is then supposed to go into the agriculture for investment. And we also can see here that there is, for some countries, the investment takes a large share of the total budget. For example, for Bulgaria, for Slovenia, but also for Estonia. So this is also something important to then keep in mind, where does the budget goes in the second pillar. Is it then more going into ENFCLIM measures, so environment, climate, agriculture measures, which is the lighter green, or does it more go into the investment measures? And now if we turn to the next slide, here we can now see the public expenditure on coupled payments. In the pie chart at the top, you see the share between the money that goes into livestock and that goes into plants. And also then in the next slide below, you can see the split between the plants. We split them again into cereals, vegetables, permanent crops, and into protein plants and fodder plants. Whereas for protein plants, we couldn't distinguish whether this is for human consumption or also for animal consumption. So this is quite kind of remains as a that it could be both. I need to increase also my size. And here what we can see then is that the livestock takes the biggest chunk of the coupled payments, which with around 67%. And here, yeah, again, that was what I was mentioned before, that the coupled payments play a decisive role in funding livestock production, not only in CE countries, also in other countries. But looking at the CE countries, it plays a decisive role here. And now if we turn to the right table, we can see the share in the blue line and in the blue column, the share of livestock in the countries covered by coupled payments, and then on the right side, the share of agriculture land covered by coupled payments. And if starting with the very right, we see that this is taking a small amount of the agricultural land that is covered by coupled payments, with around 0% for Slovenia and Slovakia and around 10% for Lithuania. But if we now look at the coupled payments, we see that the share of livestock that is funded by coupled payments is quite large for some of the countries. For Estonia, it is around 96%. For Lithuania, it's around 67%. For Poland, it's around 46%. And the average is around 35% here. So it does play a decisive role. And I think Anna will also go into this into more detail, looking into the design of the measures. What we don't do, just as a remark, we don't split into what type of livestock has been funded here. So because it does make a difference if this is cattle or small ruminants or bigger ruminants. So we don't do this in this analysis. Yeah, I already mentioned that protein plants is not clear what this where this goes to, because sometimes the CSP just don't give the information what exactly is behind an intervention. I think that's about it, and getting back to Anna.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So this is about budget allocation, and the next question is, what area is covered by different types of interventions that have or don't have climate relevance? And this can be done first by looking at the result indicators. So next slide, please. This is data from the dashboard, result indicator dashboard, that was just published this last week. It's nice because with higher degree of plant production for human consumption in areas where they're highly intensified, and also where there's many external environmental costs, those sort of things aren't really sort of simulations or scenarios can't be captured with these result indicators. And I think this is also a key issue in terms of evaluating and understanding what CAP is delivering, that we need to move beyond these result indicators to have more quantified assessment of the actual impact. Okay, next slide, please. If we look now at the target indicators for specific interventions, to get a sense of, what kind of measures are supported with what kind of reach in terms of the area. What we've done here is we've coded all the interventions for ENFCLIM and for eco-schemes. We assigned our own climate categories based on what the expected impact could be, also in terms of the climate relevance, but also categories that made sense. And some points to make here is that first of all, the area under pillar 2, you see this, for example, the category with the highest area on the right side, organic farming, comparing to the category on SOC arable. Organic farming in pillar 2 has much smaller coverage, right? So it's minor compared to Pillar 1 in terms of the total area covered. So yeah, and then when we're looking at the target indicators that we just looked at now, this means that most of that area is from eco schemes and not from ambitious Pillar 2 measures. And within eco schemes, what we can see is that the measures or interventions that really dominate are those relating to that have some relevance to maintaining or enhancing soil organic carbon on arable lands. This includes different types of practices, could be cover crops, could be some crop diversification, residue management, things like that. And then the next category around manure and fertilization. This has to do with nutrient management. It also has a lot to do with low emission slurry application or other fertilization plans, things like that. And for biodiversity measures, these are mostly measures relating to how extensively grasslands are used, specific mowing regimes, or restrictions on this doesn't include restrictions on fertilizers. That would be covered under manure and fertilization. Yeah, and under Pillar 2, by far the most important measure is organic farming, followed by various grassland management measures, which have relevance for SOC, but are effectively really about nutrient management on grasslands. And biodiversity, grassland measures where there's no clear restriction on fertilizer use, that focus mostly on habitat management via mowing, timing of mowing, etc. Those are significantly lower than those that are focused more on the nutrient management. There's also quite a bit of funding going into biodiversity and different types of forestry related measures. In terms of the peatlands or agroforestry, which, if you remember at the beginning, they have really important mitigation potential. Those are practically not supported under eco schemes, and they have really very minor share under Pillar 2 measures. For example, peatlands, peatlands under eco schemes is covered by 30,000 hectares. It doesn't show up here because the total scale of the area is so much bigger, and under NFLIM peatlands has 28,000 hectares. Whereas to compare, the SOC on arable has 25 million hectares under eco schemes, and under Pillar 2 it has 380,000 hectares. So gives you a comparison of how little the peatlands are covered, supported. And agroforestry has a total of 17,000 hectares in the whole region, which is really, given its potential both for mitigation and adaptation, there's really a lot of reserve and a lot of space to improve ambition on that. Okay, so next slide. And I'm looking at the time, I'm going to have to speed up a bit. So if we look at the relevance of different livestock measures, what we see here is really that the highest number of supported livestock are under animal welfare measure. This isn't coupled. This is under the Pillar 2, and followed by feeding and breeding. Livestock feeding has to do more with additives and so forth, whereas for animal welfare, this is really a large share of the NFCLIM, but it goes to show that in some countries, really a large number of the LSU units are being supported. So this is really a critical measure to look at, whether this is supporting extensive animal welfare measures, or if this is used and allocating money a lot to very intensive, almost industrial type farms. This is something we need to look at a bit more in detail. Okay, so to finish off, a few observations about the design of the measures. Now, next slide, please. Given that the largest share of the support continues to go to basic income support payments, and there's still significant support going to coupled payments, conditionality is really important. One remark on the peatlands, there's really strong delay in implementation. Only Romania is implementing GAIC 2 already in 23. Most others are doing it in 2025. The restrictions also vary quite a bit, and there's as of yet no clear restrictions that we could find are set for Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Croatia, and Czech Republic. So this is really an example that this conditionality requirement is likely to have very limited, if any, impact in the next few years, and then limited impact for the period as a whole. Next slide, please. For GAIC 7 and GAIC 8, these two really can have important implications, important benefits, and there is overall improvement in GAIC 7 on crop rotation. There are some crop rotation requirements included, but there's a lot of variation. For GAIC 8, what we see is that most countries actually give the option of choosing between landscape features and then the option of catch crops and nitrogen fixing crops. So there's a question of whether there would be very limited or no impact in terms of landscape features being captured under this GAIC. And what's of course important to mention is that exemptions for both GAICs are practically applied by all CEE countries. So it's a question, maybe they would be more relevant in the countries of Hungary, Czech Republic, Romania, where the corporate arable structures dominate, but this still needs to be seen. Next slide, please. In terms of the investments, what we see is that they mostly support modernization, efficiency, productivity investments. And there is the question of whether there's risks of lock-in effects for livestock and irrigation. And we see that priority given to really ambitious win-win climate measures is minor, beyond investment related to emission intensity reduction technologies. And uptake, of course, will be very much dependent on conditions and prioritization. So next slide, please. To sum up, I'll try to sum it up quickly. So majority of funding goes under Pillar 1, including large transfer of funds from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. Conditionalities are being strengthened, but they remain limited. And with the exemptions and delays, the impact is possibly very limited as well. Eco schemes focus predominantly on measures affecting SOC, but no ambitious win-win climate measures such as peatlands and agroforestry, or very limited amount is supported under eco schemes. Also, we see that significant support goes to livestock farming, and there's a question of whether this supports more intensive livestock farming. Budget allocation for ambitious interventions with really clear positive impacts is limited compared to the full budget. Organic farming is receiving more attention, but it's questioned whether there's sufficient support beyond area payments for organic farming, and area under ambitious Pillar 2 remains minor compared to eco schemes. There's also minor to no ambition for effective measures such as peatland and agroforestry, and the climate relevance of investments and also young farmers measures, which I did mention earlier, remains uncertain. But these are really very important in terms of the setting the direction of travel and preventing further lock-in. So this is something we'll be looking at in more analysis, and we'd also be very keen in hearing your insights. And next slide. In short, to say there is incremental progress, there is some ambition that we see, but it remains very limited on win-win measures for climate, and there's some potential red flags around coupled animal welfare and investment interventions. Okay, that's it.